Welcome back. You're still watching The Globe. Now, two human rights groups have accused armed forces from Ethiopia's Amhara region of waging a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Tigrayans. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch accuse Amhara officials and regional special forces and militias fighting in Western Tigray of committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. They also accuse Ethiopia's military of complicity in those acts. The rights organizations have spent over a year interviewing more than 400 people. They also used satellite imagery to gather evidence from the region, which has been extremely difficult for journalists, aid groups and others to access. The Amhara regional government has denied the allegations. The conflict in Tigray has been raging for more than a year. And according to the UN, the war has left hundreds of thousands of people on the brink of famine. Well, for a little bit more on this report, we're now joined by Laetitia Bader, who's Ethiopia expert and senior researcher in the Africa division at Human Rights Watch. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, and welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Great, great. So this evidence that the Amhara officials are denying, is it sound? Are you comfortable with what you've been able to gather as a true reflection of the situation on the ground?
Well, as you described, we've spent over a year gathering testimonies, and this was not only in order to document in as much detail what was proving to be very, very serious crimes, but it's also in the midst of the research, there were new waves of atrocities. So what we describe in this report is an organized campaign of ethnic cleansing, which happened in several waves over the last 16 months, targeting Tigrayans in the western Tigray zone, which is now controlled by Amhara administrations and security forces. And what we found was a whole range of terror-inspiring tactics which were used, sexual violence, mass arbitrary arrests, and then forced expulsion of the Tigrayan communities. Hundreds, if not thousands, were expulsed directly from detention facilities when they had been rounded up in the initial months of the conflicts, and others were basically put on buses, forced to leave. And these waves of forced expulsions have continued into early 2022.
You say ethnic cleansing. So basically the crime is being Tigrayan, and they want them removed from the area completely.
Yes, I mean, what we saw very early on in the first few weeks of the conflict, a lot of the fighting actually happened in Western Tigray. And this is where we documented war crimes by Ethiopian federal government forces, indiscriminate shelling, extrajudicial killings of the population in this area, which led to massive flight. So a lot of the people we initially interviewed for this research were actually refugees who'd fled into Sudan. But then what happened after about a month or so into the conflict was that the government forces, both federal and then Amhara regional forces, were blocking the routes into Sudan. So people had nowhere to flee. And what we were seeing then is, especially from around late December onwards, were these increasingly verbalized threats against the Tigrayan population. This had also come after a lot of Tigrayans' property, crops had been looted. This is a very fertile area, so a lot of the community are dependent on agriculture. And what we saw and what we documented was targeted attempts to deprive the Tigrayan population of their means of survival. And that is very much one of the trends we document, which coerced many civilians to actually leave the area, leave Western Tigray.
So directly, it's the Amhara security forces and officials, but has Addis Ababa had a hand in this at a federal level?
Well, absolutely. I mean, both. There is a responsibility from the federal government around abuses which happened on its territory, but we documented their direct involvement also in these abuses, in the war crimes, in the early phases of the conflict. But federal government forces remained in this area throughout. So we documented their involvement in the mass incarceration of Tigrayans, which is one of the most ongoing concerns we have. Even in November, December last year, when there was a new wave of atrocities where around 30,000, especially older men and women with young children, were again forcibly expelled from the region into other parts of Tigray. We also documented mass arrests again of men or boys of the age of 17 to men of the ages of 50. And our concerns there is that their situation in detention conditions has steadily been deteriorating. And we've increasingly been documented cases of individuals in detentions, dying in detentions, because of the conditions, but also because of torture. Now, why I'm mentioning the detention situation is that, especially in the early phases, but throughout, we have continued to document the presence of federal government forces at facilities or involvement in some of the arrests. We also documented incidents where federal government forces actually accompanied the convoys of Tigrayans who were being forcibly expulsed by the Amhara forces from the region. So in this report, we name 3 individuals from the Amhara security forces and administration that need to be immediately suspended and investigated for command responsibility roles in the crimes that we have documented in this report. But we're also calling for the suspension and investigation of federal government forces, Amhara regional government forces as well. So there are a whole host of responsibilities here that we're talking about, and why the Ethiopian federal government has a role, both in the investigation, both in the immediate actions which need to happen to protect those who are still in detention facilities, those who are still in that region, but also to allow for independent humanitarian access. This is a region where there are no independent ears or eyes on the ground. There is a very, very small international humanitarian presence there. And so it is absolutely key that the federal government is allowing in international humanitarian actors, including into detention facilities.
There has been this humanitarian truce announced just a few days ago, actually. And I wonder if that has improved the situation in terms of some of these rights abuses that have been perpetrated. It's one thing opening a corridor for aid to get through, but these detentions and other violent acts, do they continue?
So the trickle of convoys which have gone in the last few days into other parts of Tigray, they haven't gone into Western Tigray, which is still controlled by Amhara government forces and administration. I mean, we've been making very clear for many months now that allowing in unhindered humanitarian assistance should not be linked to any sort of negotiations. It is an obligation under international law to allow in humanitarian assistance. So where the relevance here is that, of course, many of the Tigrayans who are displaced in the parts of Tigray who've been affected by the effective siege in place for many, many months now, were those who were forcibly expulsed from Western Tigray. So this is a population, obviously, which had suffered immensely already before being expelled, and then find themselves in other parts of Tigray, often as internally displaced communities in internally displaced sites, and are then facing the massive obstruction on humanitarian assistance, but also the ongoing shutdown of services. As we speak, there is still no electricity, there's still no banking system, there's still no commercial activity, which are obviously going to be almost even more important, of course, to allowing the community to have their means of survival as the humanitarian assistance is.
We've been talking pretty much about the front line, if I can use an expression. There was a time that even in Addis Ababa that Tigrayans were being picked up randomly and being arrested and rounded up just because they were Tigrayan. Is that a practice that you've observed and one that continues?
So we've also documented a lot of these waves, and there were many parallels. When the new waves of atrocities were happening in Western Tigray, it was often at the same time as the new sweeps against Tigrayans in other parts of the country. Now, the last sweep was following the state of emergency, which was declared in November, which has since been lifted. Massive arbitrary arrests, enforced disappearances of Tigrayans from all walks of life, not only in Addis Ababa, in the capital, which is what has received a lot of attention, but throughout Ethiopia. There have been many people who have since been released, but we continue to be very concerned about a significant amount who are still in detention. We, for example, have documented the fate of hundreds of Tigrayans that were deported from Saudi Arabia last year. And the Tigrayans who were deported were, in fact, arrested upon arrival. And we know of hundreds that are still in detention facilities almost 8-9 months later. So while there have definitely been releases, there are still many Tigrayans who are in detention throughout Ethiopia just because of their identity.
Laetitia Bader, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very, very much indeed for giving us some very, very important information about the situation on the plight of Tigrayans at this time in Ethiopia. Thank you so much.